Okay, this lecture is on US foreign policy, security, and strategy. The logic of strategy is really about how to win wars. Strategy is about making force usable for political purposes. Tactics is about employing troops in battle, and operational art is about conducting campaigns. If you're looking at the case of Nazi Germany, for example, there were certainly a mastery of tactics and operations, as you saw the Blitzkrieg in the early period of the war. But that counts for very little without a coherent, feasible strategy, and ultimately lost the war for numerous reasons. We had the US Ghost Army during the Second World War. They staged more than 20 battlefields with these inflatable tanks. Now, of course, if you talk about strategy, we must also talk about Karl von Clausewitz, very much the father of our, in the realist tradition on our understanding of strategy. Strategy is or should be a rational process during peace and wartime, he says. No one starts a war, or rather no one in his senses ought to do so without first being clear in his mind what he intends to achieve by that war and how he intends to conduct it. So sound strategy is formulated by individuals, but still all strategies have to be implemented by bureaucracies. So different agencies and largely the armed forces, of course. So even rational strategy can fail. We have a range of strategic choices that, of course, very much depends on political realities, constrained by material, how powerful, how weak your particular country is, and what resources you have. And of course, an enemy has a strategy too. War itself is rife with passion, inaccurate information, misperception, and a lot of chance too. So military success by itself is often insufficient to achieve victory. If you're looking at the US and Vietnam, also look at the US and Afghanistan. Looking at Americans in the Revolutionary War, facing down and ultimately winning the British Empire. So it's not often the more powerful country or powerful actor that wins, but we have a lot of variables involved of why war leads to certain outcomes. Clausewitz talks about three poles, and we largely call them the Clausewitz and Trinity, and that goes that if for war to be successful, all military operations evolve around three poles: the commander of the armed forces, so the military at the top, the government on the right, so war subordinate to policy and subject to reason, and then the people. He talks about primordial violence and passion. So of course, if you project that to democracy, if you're looking at the military, the people, and the government, if all three of these poles are in support of a particular operation, campaign, or war itself, most likely that war will be legitimate and will enjoy support and perhaps be more likely to be successful. Now we saw that with, for example, the Vietnam, the government and the military. Now with the Pentagon Papers, the military said that this was unwinnable, and the government kept lying to the population, the American society, for some time, and it led to widespread unrest and protest by Americans. We also saw that with the Iraq War, sort of a war of choice, the public was fiercely critical several years into the invasion of Iraq. So you can see that that trinity is important for sort of the longevity of military campaigns. Now, if you're looking at strategic thought, grand strategy is not purely a product of one actor's influence, the plans by a defense or foreign policy establishment, but we're looking at 5 basic elements. Strategic environment, so these are the realist notions of interstate relations and power balancing. Geopolitical assets, so the physical human resources at a country's disposal. Strategic culture, beliefs and preferences of a country associated with foreign relations. State-society relations, so the interaction of private and public sectors in society. And then structural arrangements, the institutions of power inside a country. So these 5 basic elements really shape strategic thought. Now, moving on to sort of the genesis of US security strategy, really the involvement and the nature of US foreign interventions and military commitments overseas is constantly debated. So early on, we had sort of strategic detachment, focus was on containing threats at home, free alliances, little involvement overseas. Then we had evolution into a naval focus, expansion of sea power. So there was at the turn of the 20th century, that drew the United States then, of course, in the First World War and then the Second World War. So sea power in particular was very, very important for American growth of power and for American protection of power. That, of course, American power was the primary reason why Western countries were could balance against the Soviet Union. So containment of communism was largely underwritten by US military power. And of course, the US took on hegemonic roles in Europe, Africa, and South America. And to this day, the US bears the military cost for other countries in order to preserve security and stability in different regions. So we're looking at, extended deterrence, Middle East, and parts of Asia. We have three grand strategies: neo-isolationism, so very much interest-based foreign policy; liberal internationalism; and primacy. So neo-isolationism is basically a strategy of restraint. America should focus on its own national interest. Activist globalist role is no longer needed in post-Cold War era, and the US feels extraordinarily secure from external threats and with the power to guarantee its own security, largely blessed, sitting between the Pacific and the Atlantic. Liberal internationalism, so expansive American national interests, includes world peace, necessitates multilateral engagement in pursuit of common goals. So we're looking at, support for international institutions. The US is not immune from military or new security threats, and the central premise here: democracy, human rights, interdependence, and role of institutions. So again, liberal internationalism is very much an American product, deeply rooted in American idealism. And then lastly, primacy. The notion here is to preserve US power as the undisputed preeminent power in the international system. The most advantageous position for achieving national security is pursuit of primacy, and the US therefore always must ensure military dominance, preventing emergence of a multi-power structure. Institutions are seen as unnecessarily restraining American power, and policies focusing on primacy or being informed by primacy would shy away from being committed to institutions. Now, if you're looking at militarization of US foreign policy under Bush, we see one primary example of primacy. So in the early years, Pentagon moved very aggressively to eclipse State Department as the major locus of US foreign policy. We had the greatest misuse of US intelligence in history with the war in Iraq. And then the Bush administration escalated worldwide and continuous war on terrorism. So if you're looking at the rise of military expenditure from 2001 till 2009, you see that the US is still outspending the rest of the world, but you see the sharp rise in military expenditures, and largely for the last 15 years, last 20 years, really, the US had three budgets: a defense budget, and then an Iraq war budget, and an Afghanistan war budget. That shows you also a good, so this is from a sort of a neoconservative leaning think tank, so it's somewhat polemic the way they call different periods, but you can see Carter is here, Reagan, so that we see the end of the Second World War, and that's Clinton. And then you see Iraq war, Afghanistan war, big spike, and then Obama, we have a defense freeze. So that's from 1940 till 2015, that particular graph. And of course, you see massive rise in Cold War spending. Now, the Bush years, of course, the critique was there was no near-term threat to US interests, let alone clear and present danger. So it was the concept of preventive war, which was used for the first time and perhaps for the last time in US foreign policy history. But it really, instead of trying multilateral channels to deal with terrorism, and of course the failed state scenario in Afghanistan in 2001, it very much approached the problem as the world's dominant military power. We had a rejection of established judicial civil procedures and counter-terrorist strategies. So we started in Afghanistan, and then of course we had Guantanamo Bay. And Iraq, as the center of war and terror, became a self-fulfilling sort of neocon prophecy, because Iraq then literally became the main focus for sort of a regional hub for organized crime and terrorism only after the invasion. But of course the notion was, or the premise was, that the US government did not want Saddam Hussein to control the world's second largest oil reserves. Pentagon exceeded all predecessors in appropriating control of intelligence and analysis. That wasn't the first time. Very militarized foreign policy entailed the abandonment of virtually the entire fabric of arms control agreements that were negotiated by the United States during the last 30 years. And then the White House replaced multilateral agreements with the unilateral doctrine of preventive war. So these were the main problems with Bush, and we've seen some of that was taken care of in the second term. So we had a sort of a lot of professionals in the national security apparatus and foreign policy making apparatus came back, and neoconservative sort of ideologues in key positions were pushed out. So that's the second term of the Bush administration. If you're moving on to the Obama years, we sort of see more of a sort of internationalist foreign policy, albeit with sort of realist trimming. So we have the smart power, the 3D strategy that was defense, diplomacy, and development. And the notion here really was that under Bush it was all defense, and here comes now Obama and has this that smart power strategy. What did that really mean? Of course, we had sort of a unilateral extension of drone strikes that also has, we have to keep in mind that technology had changed by then. A lot of more special forces operations, in particular, looking at the Bin Laden raid in Pakistan. A lot more reliance on allies, so we're looking at burden sharing, and overall more diplomatic engagement and an emphasis on development. So Obama really wanted to build bridges with old allies. He also wanted to build bridges with the Muslim world. He had this infamous speech in Cairo in 2008, sort of to mend relations. Then came the Arab Spring in 2011, which proved to be sort of a major wild card for the US government. So that led to protracted conflicts in the Middle East till this very day. We're looking at 2011, Libya. Arab Spring had hit Libya. Massive unrests, which became violent, and then eventually NATO intervened. But we've seen the sort of the US offshore mentality already at the time, that the US did not give troops. It was the French and the British, and largely we had was the USS Florida, a US submarine off the coast of Libya, supporting with cruise missiles. And then we saw a total failure of US leadership in Syria under Obama, which led to the total war we still have today in 2020. What we did see, we had sort of a fusion of coercive diplomacy and engagement with Iran. So we had sort of conventional deterrence in Persian Gulf. Obama very much used the Israeli card against the Iranians. We saw a lot of Iranian scientists being assassinated by Israeli intelligence, sanctions. At the same time, for the first time, Obama was reaching out over a very long period, so starting in 2009 and eventually leading to the nuclear deal in 2015. So that was a multilateral initiative by Obama, but it's sort of a merger of coercive diplomacy, but also engagement with Iran. In the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, again happened under Obama's watch. Again, failure to properly deter the Russians from doing that. We'll discuss this in more detail in the lecture on Ukraine in Russia and Europe, and looking at different perspectives on that. But again, that happened under Obama's watch. And then we had partial troop withdrawal from Iraq, 2011, Afghanistan, 2014. Really, so we saw sort of a mission fatigue. We had 15 years of sustained conflict for the US Marine Corps and the US Army in particular. So they were doing the main fighting, and they were all fighting counterinsurgency. Then we saw the rise of ISIS in 2014, and the realization within the military establishment that really what we ought to pay attention to is conventional warfare and conventional peer competitors like China, like Iran, and like Russia. And that is the US Navy and the US Air Force, which needed the latest hardware and equipment. So we saw sort of a sea change in military thinking around that time, 2015, while the US still needed to fight counterinsurgency, in particular, as ISIS came of age in 2014 and Iraq and Syria, a lot focus and emphasis was shifted on equipping the Navy and the Air Force with the hardware they are required. And then lastly, moving on to the Trump years, so, this populist America First foreign policy proved to be very disruptive to the international status quo and the liberal order, which has been defended by the US since 1945. We had increased defense spending, we had that rift with NATO allies. It's almost seen as sort of a racketeering type mentality that in order for the US to come to the aid of allies, they had to pay. It did not alter US global military footprint. On the contrary, it didn't shift burden on defending US allies either. Rather than the US increased heavily defense spending and also maintained involvement in conflicts in Afghanistan and Syria. The so-called peace deal with Afghanistan seems very shaky, to say the least. And then we had failure, of course, of diplomacy towards Iran and then engagement towards North Korea. So looking at sort of diplomacy towards Iran was done only from a coercive point of a few with no diplomacy attached whatsoever. And on the other side, towards North Korea, it was only sort of a charm offensive, diplomatic charm offensive with no deterrence backed up. So again, it really was the way around. So it was very coercive towards Iran by withdrawing from the deal, and it was very based on a charm offensive with North Korea without really any beef behind it. And then lastly, of course, we see the appeasement of Russia during the Trump years, where Trump has and continues to contradict a national security establishment on the threat of the Russians, whether it's to do with elections in 2016, elections in 2020, and overall what the Russians mean to US security and interest. So again, if you're looking at those three, in terms of grand strategy, we see neo-isolationism, Trump, giving up voluntarily US leadership in international relations. Liberal internationalism, so we saw Obama, commitment to multilateralism, but we had some realist leanings under it, and then primacy, unilateralism, and endless wars under George W. Bush.